Software houses were important to me on the rare occasion I purchased a ZX Spectrum game. Ocean fluctuated but felt reliable. The same could be said for companies like Elite Systems, US Gold, Gremlin Graphics, etc. You always checked their games out and then went on to magazine reviews if you fancied parting with some of your hard-earned pocket money for one. I was generally oblivious, rather ignorantly, to the names of the actual programmers of games. In hindsight, this was a much better barometer for the quality of the title. Ocean's Joffa Smith titles would be a good example of finding good games amongst some of the awful licenses they put out at the time. It really was an oversight on my behalf, but I generally didn't care. Most games were unfortunately copied, so without the financial risk involved, I didn't much mind who or where the game came from. And then there was Don Priestley. A teacher by trade, Don got into computers quite late in 1979 at 39 years old. It all started because he wanted his 18-year-old son to look at computer programming as a career path, so enrolled both of them, himself for moral support, to a night school Pascal course which didn't have a computer in sight. His son, soon dropped out, but Don was suitably hooked, and his first program was a basic translation of a program he continued working on when the course had finished. He bought a ZX81 specifically to run it, and the ball started rolling for expanding what programs he could create. After buying computer magazines to further his hobby, he noticed an abundance of people selling games to software publishers or by mail order, and considered having a go himself. His first game that he managed to sell to Bug-Byte for £75 was the ZX81 game called Damsel and the Beast. Inspired from a very early text-based basic game called Mugwump, it was very much a game of its time and available hardware where imagination was very much king. You would pore over the instructions as they whisked you off to some fantasy land, and it didn't matter that it was just some numbers or letters on a dark screen. The fact you could move them on your TV was enough, with a little imagination added to the mix. Some more games followed on the ZX81, most notably another on the Bug-Byte label called Dictator. In a rare 1998 interview with Philip B., Don remarked that Dictator was his personal favourite of all of his games. An interesting text-based strategy affair in which it finds you running as a president for a country in tatters. You will be murdered or at very least exiled, so the aim of the game is to stay in power long enough to make as much money as possible before making a swift exit. It's interesting and worthy of a more detailed look, either here on the ZX81 version or the more colourful ZX Spectrum one that came out a year or so later. Another ZX81 game to note that helps us segue into the more interesting ZX Spectrum catalogue is Mazogs. With the 16K expansion, this is much more a graphical affair that is often regarded as one of the best ZX81 games to exist at that time. A relatively simple game of finding the treasure within a map that is guarded by nasty creatures that you can fight and defeat providing you have a sword. Fast-paced enough with big graphics, it was truly impressive on the ZX81, and like Dictator also made it onto the ZX Spectrum in the slightly rebranded and certainly upgraded brilliance that was called Maziacs. Both Maziacs and Dictator came out on another label that was interestingly more renowned for its hardware than software. For example, here is me holding my original Kempston joystick interface, clearly DKTronics badged. DKTronics were very much a one-man band, with David Helas making ZX80 and ZX81 products out of the garden shed before the ZX Spectrum exploded onto the scene, marking the real entrance of good, reliable, cheaply priced home micros. David employed more staff and branched out into more areas, software sales being one of those, and two of Don's ZX Spectrum games made it onto the label. The first of which was this rather average Asteroids clone titled Meteoroids, and the other was arguably Don's biggest ever selling game on the ZX Spectrum, 3D Tanx. In this, you move your tank from left to right to avoid incoming shells, whilst getting the trajectory of your shells to hit the enemy tanks that can be on one of three pathways in front of you. Destroyed tanks are kept on the battlefield until merciless enemies destroy them to enable them to continue along the bridge. A fairly simple game that looks pretty good for 1982 and was surely a good advertisement at the time for the potential the ZX Spectrum had. By March 1983, Don decided to join DKTronics as a director for them full time. In this first year, he made a further 4 games for the label: Dictator and Maziacs, as already mentioned, an underperforming seller called Jumbly, based on the popular sliding tile based puzzle games that were everywhere at the time, and another title called Spawn of Evil. Not a game for the playground pirates in a you can't just load this up and expect to jump straight in vibe. Quite a complicated game plot wise that is justifiably praised by the kids who understood it and played it to death. By 1984, DKTronics were looking at interesting licenses to further expand their software library and managed a licensing deal with Thames Television for a number of TV shows, including Minder, Benny Hill, The Sweeney, and according to some reports, even Rambo. On top of this, they also acquired the rights to make a Popeye-based game based on the King Features Syndicate cartoon. This was originally not a Don Priestley game, but the original programmer let DKTronics down with a rather average unfinished platform one. King Features were adamant that the game had to include a fair representation of the lead characters, which posed a few problems for Don. He started to draw some characters out and ended up with one that was 7 characters high and 6 wide, thus being a whopping 42 characters to move for each frame. Although this easily satisfied the licensor King Features, it posed a number of challenges for Don that took him close to walking away from the project altogether. How would he fit all these big graphic characters into the Spectrum's rather limited memory? How would he cope with moving the characters around in front of cartoon-like backgrounds? Colour clash was going to be a big problem in more ways than one. Showing the characters on their own to King Features was a hit. They loved it and were excited to see how the whole thing would stitch together. So these challenges really need to be addressed. Taken directly from the 1990 interview itself, as I've never admitted to understanding any of these issues, Don explained what he did to navigate around the colour clash issue.
It was solved by giving each graphic cell a code to tell it, if it ever became a background, that is, covered by part of another cell, whether it is paper or it's ink, would be the paper of the overlying cell, if you see what I mean. A plan of the whole screen was mapped into memory layer by layer and then printed in its entirety. This made the whole thing grindingly slow. For later programs, I used alternating maps and only printed any changes, and this speeded things up considerably.
The graphics work alone was very tough going, with several other programs written just to help lift some of the work needed. The game was finally finished and released to critical acclaim. Crash gave it a Smash Award, and most importantly, I loved it too. Yes, it was clunky and pretty tough to play, but this was like nothing else I'd seen before, and I was suitably impressed. Less impressive was the only other title to appear by the end of 1985 from this Thames Television licensing deal, the game of the hit TV show Minder. The game isn't actually that bad, a kind of trading simulator with lots of core blimey Charlies thrown in for good measure. The game was actually written twice as too many things were going wrong with it, but things progressed to a point of no return, and it was seemingly released with the basic structure of the game bearing little or no resemblance to the source material. It did okay, with Crash giving it 75%, primarily based upon its addictive qualities. Minder wasn't a TV show I was overly bothered about when I was 11, so the game did pass me by, but Don's final game in that Thames Television deal certainly didn't. The first time I saw Benny Hill, I immediately recognised the graphics. I mean, it wouldn't take a rocket scientist to see the similarities between Benny Hill and Popeye, but I was a simple lad with simple pleasures, and seeing this resemblance instantly meant I knew what I was talking about and should therefore follow Don's work with investment into the games he was making so I could appear all knowledgeable and shit. This was the first and only time the author had meant something to me. Matthew Smith maybe when Set Willy was released, but I didn't have the same excitement at the time that I did here. Playing games with humongous characters that looked pretty darn cool at the same time gave me that, hey Dave, have you checked out the latest Don Priestley game? This would be my all-knowing mantra in the playground. Benny Hill was easier than Popeye, moved a bit quicker maybe, but wasn't quite as pretty, and there was definitely more clashing than Popeye going on, but it was still super fun for the short time I had on my most definitely pirated copy. So, my newfound admiration for all things Don had to wait a few months for a rather strange title that turned out really to be the best of the lot. Trapdoor was a 5-minute long animation voiced by Willie Rushton on ITV that didn't air until the 6th of October in 1986. The game though came out a month or so prior to this and was reviewed in magazines before we even got to see the animation. I had a vested interest though and pored over the reviews. It was quite obviously stunning to look at. Phil South in Your Sinclair even remarked that it wouldn't look out of place on the Commodore Amiga, and looking at it, it was hard to disagree. This was a full pricer though on the new Piranha label that was the software name for book publishers Macmillan. They had already published DKTronics Popeye, but Don had started working for them when DKTronics decided to concentrate their efforts away from the ever increasingly difficult to master games business. So for me, it wasn't an immediate purchase, but once I eventually got round to seeing the TV show, I knew I had to get the game. For a short period of time, it was arguably the most sought after game for me and my friends. We just had to have it. So when I eventually got my hands on the game, which I'm almost certain I did end up buying, was I disappointed, as was often the case when you build things up in your head to be something they aren't? Well, in short, no. This was everything we had hoped it would be. It was so immersive, so true to the TV series, and so much fun controlling this huge Burke character, trying to do all the jobs requested of him. It certainly was a challenge, but I do vaguely remember finishing it, but this might have been a poked-filled completion, I'm not sure. I've picked up the game again now for the first time in years to see if it was indeed a possibility for 12-year-old me, if 51-year-old me can do it straight away. And I remembered how to get the worms and grow eyeballs, so it was definitely something I was probably close to doing. There were 5 tasks to complete as Super Burke, which gave the game to you in its entirety. You could play as Learner Burke and complete just 4 tasks, and not complete the game, but get rather good at it instead, and with everything being that bit easier to master. It's worth noting that the Commodore 64 and CPC versions of the game here look and play just about the same, and, well, why wouldn't they? Any Commodore 64 fanboy at the time would have been just as impressed with the graphics on show here. So with Popeye, Benny Hill and now Trapdoor, I was most certainly keeping my eye out for future Don Priestley titles in the same graphical design as these games. In 1987, another 2 titles in the same graphical style were released, another Trapdoor game, and before that, this one, Flunky. Crash Magazine kinda hated it, which I never understood. They nitpicked over some of the colour clash and small screen estate, both of which are not really an issue. Some screens are small, but others aren't. Colour clash is handled just as well here as it is in any of the similar games, but in addition to all of that, this moves at a tremendous pace, with only the occasional slowdown, which was obviously worked on from the previous game's experience. I was much more in the Sinclair user review, honestly, and loved this tongue-in-cheek look at being a butler for the Royals. It was certainly tough, but with the aid of maps, it's very playable today and definitely worthy of your time. Crash Magazine did like Through the Trapdoor, the second 1987 game, a little more than Flunky, but still moaned about the same problems. Again, if you compare this to the original game, it moves so much better. New puzzles and the ability to play as Burke or Drut was also appealing, although I do remember struggling with figuring out the puzzles on this one. I think the original always trumped this for me because the puzzles felt more like tasks or chores, if that makes sense, and the sequel had more arcadey elements which sometimes detracted a little from the source material for me. Your Sinclair's 8 out of 10 review summed it up perfectly though. It's lovely to play, Drut is really annoying and the puzzles are really tough. But with looking at some guides and getting some help, this is a very good game indeed. And then, as far as I was concerned, that was it. Macmillan closed the doors on Piranha only after 18 months, citing poor financial returns, and Don's big character games were put to bed. I was okay with this, I guess. Ocean Software had upped their game somewhat, there were plenty of absolute belters to keep me happy, and every once in a while I would return to Burke and his friends to enjoy those big guys once more. My ZX Spectrum was replaced with a PC, then later a Super Nintendo, a Mega Drive, a bigger and better PC, a PlayStation 2, a PlayStation 3, a PlayStation 4 and even a PlayStation 5, and then I started making YouTube videos with a new interest in exploring all those old games again. I rather enjoyed poring through the old reviews in magazines like Crash to help me find games I might have missed. I came up with a video idea of games that received a crash smash that I certainly didn't remember playing. Imagine my surprise then when I stumbled across a Mastertronic Plus game called Gregory Loses His Clock, a $2.99 budget affair with very familiar looking graphics, which when I read on was because this was actually another Don Priestley big graphics game. Released in 1989, some 2 years after the Piranha games, this was very much more of the same please, with a more arcadey feel like Through the Trapdoor had. Mind-boggling puzzles that annoyed me from the get-go, but I was thrilled after all these years later to be playing a new fresh Don Priestley game once again. The smile on my face whilst I was frustratingly playing this game went from ear to ear. This is why I love this hobby, and this is why Don Priestley's larger-than-life games will always have a place in my heart. Thanks Don for doing something a little different and for making me realise how important it was to know who was writing the games I was playing, and also for keeping me on this journey of finding new authors to admire and respect as much as I did for you.
Somewhere in the dark and nasty regions, where nobody goes, stands an ancient castle. Deep within this dank and uninviting place lives Burke. Hello. Overworked servant of the thing upstairs. Burke, feed me. But that's nothing compared to the horrors that lurk beneath the trap door. For there is always something down there, in the dark, waiting to come out.
Don't you open